My name is Graham Johnson, welcome back to Tabletop Glory, and today I took the less than metaphorical knife to some Magic the Gathering cards.
You what?
Now before you guys go ripping my head off about destroying a holographic, don't worry, this card is just fine. We're not destroying this one. We're using some generic lands today, nothing of any particular value. I've been talking for a while about how I want to do a diorama inside a Magic card, as though you're looking through an open window. Now today's video is more or less a proof of concept, which is why it's not super high quality. It's good enough for me though. I really enjoyed the process. I think it's a great proof of concept. I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to love the final result. If I continue forward with this project and I start doing more Magic cards, I plan to do a much wider field of view. I'm probably going to 3D print boxes that the card will slot into on the front, so that way we can have about an inch or two of depth to play with for the diorama itself. And also in case I want to install some lights in the ones going forward. Now ultimately I know that I want the side of this thing to potentially look like a stack of cards when it's in the plastic clamshell, so I thought the best way to sell this illusion would be to go ahead and line the edge of the diorama in foam. This is also going to help bulk out underneath where the mana symbol is, as there's not going to be anything there, and it'll be a nice chunky place for people to hold onto it when they want to see it outside of the clamshell. So I went rummaging around in my pile of scraps and I found this piece, and it was about the right depth for what I wanted. I could have gone with something a little thinner, but it'll work just fine. And then we went ahead and cut that out using a X-Acto knife. Now this part is probably the most important part, so you want to record the side of your head so that your audience can't see anything. Guys, I'm just tracing the line that I drew with the pencil. Sorry, this tends to happen sometimes when I gotta get my face in there to really see what I'm doing. Now here I went ahead and marked out about where I thought the horizon line was on the original artwork, and we're just gonna go ahead and trace out the mountains and then cut those out. Now if I really wanted to get fancy, I could have traced out the window effect that I wanted and then trace the mountains out and then just cut out the part that I wanted to remove. It would have been a lot of extra work, especially when it came time to shaving down the mountains to try and give that 3D appearance that I end up with the final result. And honestly, it was just so much easier to do it this way. I would probably end up just slicing off the entire side and creating a new wall for that side piece if somebody commissioned me to do something like this again in the future, just to give a smooth surface all the way from one end of the card to the other. But honestly, like I've been saying this entire time, it's just a proof of concept, so as long as it gets there in the end, then that's all that matters to me. Now here you can see me just scoring along the horizon line. This is what I'm going to shave the mountains down to kind of help sell that 3D illusion that I want to do. Now, honestly, if I was going to do this again, I would probably cut these mountains out of a piece of cardstock and then maybe use some kind of like spackling putty or some kind of similar product to that to kind of build up some texture on these mountains, as opposed to doing it all out of foam like this. I feel like I would have gotten a much more realistic finish, but that also having been said, that's a lot of moisture to be putting on the card that I'm using as the backing for this project, and that really increases the chances of that card starting to ripple and warp, which we only suffered from in one place on this project, which you don't even see until the very end. So I'm pretty proud of myself for managing to not ripple this card. Now I know I'm kind of committing a cardinal sin by kind of pushing this knife inward toward the project and toward my fingers. I am being unbelievably careful here, but honestly, you really shouldn't do this. I just have the confidence of doing things like this over many years, which unfortunately also means I've had many cuts from every time the knife is slipped, which should teach me to stop doing this, but habits are hard to break. You can see me here just going ahead and lining things up and kind of giving things a good check to see if the alignment is where I really want it to. The mountains are a little bit high, but you know, I can live with it. I think it's going to work just fine. Now, if you've ever paid attention to a piece of paper that you've gotten wet, you'll notice that it likes to ripple and buckle and kind of just warp and change shape. This is just due to the fact that the fibers of paper or cardboard will absorb moisture and then release it at different intervals, which can cause stretching and warping. And it doesn't really have anywhere to go on a piece of paper, so it just kind of ripples and buckles. And that can happen when you paint trading cards. If you're not careful, if you don't have a way to lock them down nice and flat and hold them down flat, and you put too much paint on at once or too much moisture on at once, it can very easily ripple and ruin the card. Magic the Gathering is already very particular about trading cards that have been altered, and if you're going to try to paint cards at home, you need to be very particular about making sure that it doesn't mark the card through the back of the card through rippling the card, or they will not allow you to use it even if it's in a sleeve. Now, that having been said, none of that really matters here because we're just making a diorama. However, I would really like the card that I'm using as the backing, which is a duplicate of the one I'm trying to replicate, to still be nice and flat so that when you view it from one side, you can see the original card and then flip it over and see my interpretation of the diorama. So throughout the rest of this process, I try to use super glue when and where I can, and I try to use it in very small amounts. This is so that very little moisture gets locked into the card, because I already know that when I go to start painting the backdrop, that's a lot of moisture that's going to end up in that card. And I want to try to limit that as much as I can so that we don't end up with any rippling. Fingers crossed. So I did a bit of a jump cut here because it was just kind of a lot of the same thing over again. It was just me laying out these pieces, deciding which ones I thought would work best based on the border of the card, marking them out with a pencil, or in this case, just a quick little cut on the foam, and then cutting it out and gluing it in place, like I said, with super glue, as we're trying to reduce buckling. Now, if for any reason you're ever trying to be stingy with super glue because you don't need a whole lot of it, you can use a toothpick like a paintbrush and just apply what you need where you need it. This is also a really great way of making sure that you only get glue on the parts you want and reducing fogging. You'll see in the next clip here that there is no fogging on the card. For those of you at home who have ever built a model plane kit or a model train kit and perhaps used super glue to glue on your windows, you'll notice that they fog up really bad, and there's not really a whole lot you can do to clean that up afterward. This is a really great way to reduce that by using as little glue as possible. Also, that fogging is caused by off-gassing, so also working in a well-ventilated area and keeping the air moving around the parts you're gluing together is also a really great way of reducing that fogging. Now at this point, I'm starting to work on these trees. I've kind of marked out where I want the 5 of them to go. However, at this point in time, I should have started working on the grass, and I'll talk more about that later when I actually do work on the grass and why I think I should have started it now. But for now, I'm just using some of this heavy gauge wire that I had in my bits box. I have no idea what gauge this is, so I'm sorry if you're following along at home. Just use something that feels appropriate for you. Now this tree is the farthest one in the foreground, so that's going to be my biggest gauge. And then the rest of them I'm going to be using an extremely small gauge that I've got for other projects. I'm actually going to be twisting multiple pieces of wire together for those. And I'm going to be using less and less wire for the trees that are the farthest and farthest away, in hopes that this will sell the fact that the trunks of the trees are smaller, because, you know, that's how perspective works. Now I noticed this one tree had a branch on it. This ends up being a bit of a waste, and I also soldered it on, which was probably way overkill. At this scale, once I get the greenery on the trees, you don't really see it anymore. It was a good idea to try to replicate the artwork a little bit closer, but in reality, you know, theory versus practice, it just didn't quite work out the way I hoped it would. Now, I'll be honest, I should have used a bit of Mod Podge, but I couldn't find it, so I mixed some black paint with some PVA glue. So that is why you'll see me avoiding the card, because PVA's got a lot of water in it, and again, if this episode is brought to you by anything, it's water. Now, if the card was going to ripple somewhere, this is probably where it would have rippled. I'm really just kind of slopping the paint on, and in fact, I actually have to use a hairdryer to dry the layers as quick as possible to avoid that rippling effect that I was worried about earlier. I also figured that by having these sloppy layers that was going to help build up some texture for the clouds later on. However, at this point, it has not occurred to me that I don't know how to paint clouds. I knew that my clouds were going to contain two colors mostly, and that was going to be that bone white initially and this sky blue color, and I figured that by mixing the two together that was going to get me a lot of volume for my clouds. I knew in the original artwork it appeared that they used 3 different colors with various blends between the 3 to create the highlights and the shadows as well as the midtones. Now, this style of doing clouds is oftentimes referred to as volumetric clouds, and although I have vague experience in doing them in a cartoon style, it was right around now where I suddenly started to realize that I have never done clouds in a realistic style before, and I really don't know what I'm doing. So I cold stop working on the clouds and switch over to working on the mountains, and I'm just kind of trying to work through in my mind how I'm going to do this. And I end up settling on a stippling method to do the clouds, and I think ultimately it works just fine considering the way that everything else looks when it's all said and done. But if I'm going to do this again, I definitely think that I need to sit down and teach myself how to do a more realistic cloud texture before I try to do something like this again. Now, I'm mostly working with black and this bone color to create my gradient of grays, as well as I'm mixing in some browns and other earth tones. I'm not really leaving the brown spectrum, although I do add a tiny bit of yellow at one point. And it's just a lot of wet blending, but stippling with wet blending and just kind of building up the layers over time. Now, I could have taken this to a more extreme, however, when I got a good look at the artwork on the card, these mountains kind of actually felt like they had been painted with a watercolor brush in Photoshop. And for all I know, that might be how they were made. I know a lot of Magic the Gathering cards these days are entirely done on computers, so there's a good chance that that's what was done. So I decided to use some similar techniques when it came to painting these mountains on my diorama. Ultimately, I settle on these not quite horizontal lines that I'm just kind of running across the sky. They mostly get covered up by the greenery I'm going to add later, but it's ultimately fine. I'm kind of more or less just experimenting around at this point and seeing what works for me. I'm using a little bit of this gray left over from my mountains mixed with a tiny bit more of the blue color that I used for the sky to kind of blend everything together. And then I actually use a little bit of that sky color to just run along the top edges of the clouds, and this does a great way of separating each of the clouds individually and making their brightest highlights pop a little bit more. But it also allows for this gradient that I've done in the shadows to kind of blend into the sky a little bit better, and ultimately I think it gives a better result than if I had done a hard line on both sides of the cloud. Now, the grassy plateau that is the bulk of this card's artwork. It had this really nice windswept hill look, and it was around this time that I'm putting this glue on that I started realizing that perhaps it would have been better to have just painted the grass and to not use static grass, as trying to get static grass to lay in the same direction consistently can sometimes be quite difficult, especially when you're using quite short static grass like I'm using in today's video. Now, I also feel as though if I had been working with a deeper diorama and I could have angled that plateau and shaped it a little bit to give that rolling plains type of feel, I think the shape of the diorama would have worked in my favor without me trying to rely on the grass to tell the story. However, I definitely should have painted underneath where the grass was going with all the colors where I wanted it, so that way if anything showed through, I wouldn't have to go back over it with some paint afterward, which is actually how I fixed the card ultimately. And I don't record that with the airbrush. I was so frustrated with the final result of the static grass at that point that I just wanted to do the airbrushing and get it done. So I do apologize for not recording that, but I was actually just really frustrated with this project at that point. It was such an easy mistake to make, and I felt so stupid for not seeing it coming, but you can't know what you don't know, and so I had to learn this lesson the hard way. However, all of that having been said, I am using a darker grass to simulate the shadows of the trees, and then I am using a much brighter yellow color to be the grassy plains. That doesn't really show through quite as well in the final result, since I have to spray some paint over top of everything to kind of blend it all together. However, I think enough of that shadow idea is still there ultimately in the final product, and it's definitely worth coming back to this at some point in the future and using these two different tones to create shadows like I had originally intended. I think there's something to this, and I definitely think it could work in my advantage if I plan things out a little bit better next time. Now, I know this footage isn't the best, and I do apologize. I should have gotten the camera a little bit higher, angled it a little bit more down toward the desk, but as you can see, I'm just putting a thin line of super glue down the bulk of that wire, and I know that I'm going to leave this in an aerated area, so I'm not going to have to worry about fogging. So anything that doesn't get covered in this clump foliage is still going to show that color below, which is another good reason to paint the entire wire brown and not just the bottom of it. Since this is a tree, I want to make sure that any of that wire that is exposed is still going to give the illusion that this is a tree. Now, this is a little bit tricky because I do need quite small pieces of foam, much smaller than what this clump foliage is sold as, so I'm having to kind of break it up as I put it down. And there's also some pieces that I'm having to break off once it's dry to kind of shape things up and make sure that the tree still looks tree-like and not necessarily bush-like. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to cut out the artwork from this card. Now, we've censored this for your viewing pleasure, so those of you with a weak stomach at home don't have to... Oh, who am I kidding? I got my head in the shot again and it just blurred on its own. Now, lesson learned, I guess. If I gotta get my face in there, I better put the camera at a completely different angle, because all you're gonna get is the side of my noggin. Now, I had a choice here. I could go ahead and leave the inside of this cutout white, or I could paint it black. I thought it'd be easy enough to do that with this paintbrush tipped marker. I probably should have also gone around the outside edge of the card as well, and I probably should have done that as well for the card that we used for the backing, but these are things I just wasn't thinking about in the moment that, looking back on now that I'm done with the project, I definitely would have done differently. Ultimately, this project was a lot of fun though, and I do think we'll do it again, although I don't know if we'll do it anytime soon, as I want to get quite a few things together before I try to tackle this a second time. Well, and here we have it, folks. This is the before. This is the card that inspired me to try and do this. And here we have the after. Honestly, it was a lot of fun, and I'm pretty happy with the final result, all things considered. Yeah, it's a little cartoony, but like, I made a diorama in a magic card, and I think it works. I really, really like this. Now, the trees are a little smushed, but I really like this. I think this was a lot of fun, and I think this is worth revisiting again. I would love to have more room to play with and have a larger field of depth behind the card next time, but yeah, this was a lot of fun. So is it a pass or a fail? Let me know what you guys think down below. Honestly, I think it's a pass. I've never done anything like this before, and I had a lot of fun working on it. Now, it definitely screams inspired by the artwork. I don't think anyone's gonna think it's the artwork, and that wasn't really today's goal. I wasn't trying to do a photorealistic copy, but I really do like the final result that we got today, and I'm looking forward to doing more like this in the future, although I think we'll be ditching the card cases and we'll go for something a little bit thicker. I might try to add lights down the road. I don't know if I'll put lights in the next one, but if that sounds cool, let me know in the comments below, and I'll definitely make a video when I make the next one. In any case, thanks so much for watching. May your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.